West Hartford, Connecticut, the early 1970s. A quiet residential neighborhood, the kind you find everywhere in this part of the United States. Single-family homes lined up on modest lots, trimmed lawns, clean sidewalks, a routine firmly in place. The Donovan house stood there like all the others, functional, unadorned, a carport, a small back garden, a living room facing the street. Nothing extraordinary, nothing threatening, the kind of place where you live your life without making noise. The family kept to themselves. Theodore Donovan, the father, was a reserved man. He had worked in construction for years, left the house early and came home exhausted. He spoke little, but made sure everything ran. Not an authoritarian man, just methodical, predictable. He read the paper. He watched the news. He followed a precise routine. Helen, his wife, was entirely devoted to the household. She managed the home without complaint, carrying out each task like a duty. A discreet woman, disarmingly calm, who avoided conflict and grand gestures. She was often in the background, but nothing in that house worked without her. Their son Brian still had the carelessness of adolescence. He spent most of his time in his room or outside with friends, not particularly rebellious, not particularly involved. He lived the life of a 16-year-old boy, absorbed in whatever mattered that week, staying out of what didn't concern him. And then there was Patty. Patty Donovan was 19. She was at that hinge point where you're no longer a child, but not quite an adult. She didn't work full-time, wasn't in college, but she kept busy, errands in town, helping her mother now and then. She went out rarely. She had her habits, her silences, her retreats. She wasn't lonely exactly, but she spent a great deal of time alone. She read, she wrote. Sometimes she just thought. You might have assumed she was bored. It wasn't that. She was watching something. Something in her was already turned inward, as if she perceived things a little differently. The family showed no particular warning signs, no visible tension, no significant events. Nothing suggested their balance could break. But at the beginning of 1974, something changed. It wasn't spectacular. Not a scene from a film, just a different atmosphere, a diffuse weight, hard to name. It didn't begin with an apparition or a strange noise or even with fear. It began with a habit, and with a question asked at the wrong moment. Winter had settled in for weeks, and in the Donovan house the evenings all looked alike. After dinner, everyone withdrew into their habits, their silences, that everyday life where nothing spills over. Patty spent most of her time alone in her room. She wasn't in conflict with her parents or at odds with her brother. She simply withdrew, gently, without anyone really worrying. She read, scribbled in a notebook sometimes, stared out the window when night fell. There was nothing hostile in her retreat. It was as if she were waiting for something without knowing what. One evening, without planning it, she took out the board she'd bought a few weeks earlier. She had found it in a small shop, on a walk, and picked it up out of curiosity, more than conviction. That night, once the house had gone silent, she sat on the floor, set the board in front of her, and placed her fingers on the planchette. She hesitated, then she whispered, "Is anyone there? My name is Patricia Donovan. Is there a spirit who can hear me?" She wasn't expecting an answer. She wasn't even sure she took it seriously. And yet the planchette moved. It wasn't a hesitant drift or a slight tremor from her own hands. It slid decisively, stopped on yes, and stayed there. A clear reply to a question she'd asked without belief. That was the beginning of a bond that would last nearly a year. From that night on, Patty repeated the session almost every evening, always alone, always late. The sleeping house seemed to offer the perfect quiet for this strange correspondence. She would sit on the floor, place her hands on the planchette, and wait. And almost every time something answered. Over the sessions, the dialogue sharpened. The entity would not give its name, despite her repeated questions. It refused, politely, but firmly. It said it wasn't allowed. That spirits must not reveal their identity to the living, or there would be consequences. That refusal didn't make Patty wary. If anything, it added mystery, a secret that belonged to the two of them. The answers grew longer, more precise. The entity asked questions in return, seemed to follow what she said from one session to the next, and above all, it complimented her, not crudely, not clumsily, but in small touches that made the exchanges personal. It told her she was beautiful, that it found her gentle, different from other girls. It remembered what she had been wearing, how she had tied her hair. It told her that it liked her, that she mattered. At first, Patty had assumed it was some form of self-suggestion. Then she let herself be taken in. She was not naive. She was simply vulnerable to attention. The idea that something on the other side was watching her and understood her was enough to bring her back night after night. The entity spoke about itself too. It said it had been alone for a long time before meeting her. It spoke of its death with a certain distance, without detail. It described the emptiness, the boredom, the impossibility of acting or feeling. It said that with her it was different, that she made it feel alive. It thanked her for being there, for listening. So she told it about her day, what her mother had cooked, something her brother had said, a dream she'd had. It wasn't a game anymore. It wasn't an experiment. It had become a habit, a need. Every evening she waited for that moment. There was a kind of intimacy in those sessions, a closeness, a relationship even. One Patty no longer questioned. She told no one, not her mother, not her father, not Brian. This bond belonged to her. Sometimes the spirit made more direct declarations. It wrote that it loved her, that it wished it could be with her, that it wished it had lived in her time, that it wished it could have met her. She no longer doubted. She firmly believed it was the spirit of a boy who had died young, someone gentle, solitary, like her. She began waiting for it not only at night with the board, but all day long. It occupied her thoughts. She wondered what it would say, what it would think. She shared her feelings with it. It answered accurately, with simple words, always well placed. Over time, that bond became a presence. She no longer felt alone. She felt chosen, loved, heard. One evening, she asked what it saw of her future. It answered without hesitation. It spoke of things to come, of meetings, of feelings. It even named specifics. It told her she would have 3 children by 1978. It gave her a date, details about their births, about what would change in her life. She listened without doubting. Everything it had said until then had proven true. Nothing extraordinary, but enough to feed her trust. She believed it, and she grew more attached. Sometimes it said goodbye with tender words. Until tomorrow, darling. And she would put the board away in silence, her heart tight, like after a phone call cut too short. This bond had gone beyond fascination. She had come to think of it as a boyfriend, invisible, unreachable, but real in her daily life. On a Saturday in March, with the house asleep again, Patty sat down for another session. That night, she didn't only want to talk, she wanted to see. She had waited a long time. She had dreamed about it. She wanted to put a face to that voice. She placed her hands on the planchette, closed her eyes for a few seconds, then asked, "Can you show yourself?" She waited. The board stayed still. She insisted, quietly repeating the question with hope. There was no answer, not a word. But she felt something in the air, a tension, an expectancy, not fear, not yet. Just the vague impression that her request had not gone unheard. She put the board away, a little disappointed, but not worried. He probably wasn't ready, she told herself. She would have to be patient a little longer. The next morning, Sunday, March 3rd, one of the tires on her car had been slashed, not simply flat, cut clean through in a way that made no sense. Theodore noticed it and wrote the incident on the kitchen calendar. To him it was just an inconvenience, a detail of no importance. To Patty, it was something else. It was an answer. And from that day on, she would never feel alone again. The next day, both family vehicles refused to start, and this time the damage was unmistakable. Under the hood of his own car, Theodore found the spark plug cables torn out, the hoses cut, the fan belt sliced through. The engine of Patty's car had been deliberately dismantled. Several parts were missing, as if someone, or something, had spent the night taking it apart piece by piece, without leaving a single sign of forced entry. In the days that followed, the small anomalies multiplied. One morning, the front doorbell was found ripped out. 2 days later, a decorative shrub, firmly rooted in the garden for years, had been torn from the ground overnight, its bare roots dragging like an open wound. On Wednesday, a cast-iron pipe nearly 7 feet long, fixed to the roof to hold the electrical cables, was bent at a right angle, as if a tremendous force had folded it in a single motion. Patty watched all of it in silence. She hadn't heard from the spirit in days. Every evening she took the board out again, repeated the same questions, but the planchette only slid coldly toward goodbye. She waited. She hoped. Nothing. The absence weighed on her more than the fear. She didn't understand. The silence felt unjust, like a punishment. And around her, meanwhile, the house seemed to be holding its breath. On Friday, Ted wrote flat tire on the calendar again. On Saturday, he added slashed. This time it was clear. They were no longer dealing with accidents or wear. The rubber had been cut clean, as if by a blade. The Donovans began to talk about vandalism, maybe an ill-meaning neighbor, maybe a group of teenagers. But the intruder theory collapsed with every new incident. The house stayed locked at night. The dog reacted to nothing. There was never a sign of entry. The night from Saturday to Sunday would mark the first turning point. It was a little past 10. Ted and Helen were lying on their bed in the master bedroom. Brian and Patty had settled on the floor against the wall, too anxious to stay alone in their own rooms. For several evenings now, at sunset, a series of regular blows had been striking the outer walls of the house. Sharp, deep knocks, in groups of 3, always 3. That night, they waited in silence. The knocking started earlier than usual, and this time, it didn't stop. First, the lights flickered 3 times. Then the television shut off abruptly. No breaker had tripped. Nothing was unplugged. And then, without warning, the large dresser in the bedroom lifted gently off the floor in a heavy silence. It began to rock on its feet, back and forth, as if something were playing with it. The perfume bottles, the jars of cream, the ornaments arranged on top slid off and shattered on the floor. The dresser settled back down. Then one of the drawers opened by itself. It rose slightly into the air, suspended, then slammed violently shut. The other drawers followed, one after another, in a kind of sinister dance. The fear was such that no one moved. The children stayed frozen, breath short, hands clenched on their knees. Then everything stopped. A pause. And the chair to the side, the one where Helen folded the clean laundry, rose in turn, slowly higher and higher, until the clothes fell to the floor. It tipped suddenly sideways and dropped with a dull thud. That was when the pictures on the walls came off their hooks, all of them at once. They began to turn slowly in the air, about 3 feet off the ground, drifting with no logic, as if pulled by an invisible current. Helen, eyes wide, whispered in terror, "My God, what did we do to deserve this?" The bed began to vibrate. The frame seemed to come apart. The mattress Ted and Helen were lying on collapsed to the floor with them on it. Then silence. Everything dropped at once, as if a wire had been cut. They stayed there, stunned. Brian and Patty went back to their rooms without a word. Ted and Helen tidied up, gathered what could be salvaged, rehung the pictures. They had barely turned off the light when a strange sound came from the guest room next door. A meow. The meow of a kitten. There was no animal in that house. The meowing grew deeper, longer, then slowly turned into crying. A baby. An infant crying in the dark. Helen half rose, then froze. Ted stopped her with his arm. Something in his instinct screamed at him not to open that door. Then came the knocking. Everywhere. Inside the walls, under the floorboards, along the hallways, as if the house itself were writhing under invisible hands hammering to force something out. It lasted an hour of contained violence that seemed to move from room to room. Then the sound stopped abruptly at the entrance. Silence. And suddenly, the bed began to shake again, repeated blows as if something were striking the frame from below. Ted and Helen leapt out of bed. Nobody was sleeping now. In the living room, an appalling crash rang out, as if the furniture were being hurled to the floor. Theodore grabbed a lamp and opened the door, and at that exact moment a scream that froze the blood. "Dad, Patty screaming from her room. He found her in tears, standing in the middle of the room. She pointed at a dark corner, unable to speak. Something was in here. In my room. I saw it. She was shaking, wide-eyed. Ted saw nothing, but he said nothing either. He closed the door gently, without a word. The next day, the family didn't discuss what had happened, not yet. Everyone pretended to resume their routine, but the fear had settled into every corner of the house, and meanwhile, the board stayed hopelessly silent. Monday, April 1st, early afternoon. The sky was clear over the neighborhood, the temperature mild, almost no wind. Nothing suggested what was coming. Helen was tidying up as usual. Patty had gone out on an errand. Brian was in his room. And then a sharp sound struck the roof. A single impact, almost ordinary, like a pine cone falling from a tree. Then a second, a third, and quickly a barrage. Something was bombarding the roof. Helen went to the living room window and squinted. She saw no one. No children, no neighbors. Just a stone bouncing heavily in the driveway. Another, larger, rolling toward the carport. And then a crash. A rock the size of a fist went through the back window, exploding the glass into a shower of fragments. Helen jumped back. She grabbed the phone immediately and called Theodore at work. Her voice was shaking. There was something outside, something she didn't understand. It's stones, Ted. They're falling from the sky. He told her to stay inside, lock the doors, and call the police. He was coming home right away. When he arrived, a patrol car was already there. 2 officers stood in the yard, eyes raised to a perfectly clear sky. Pebbles, stones, even rocks, kept falling out of nowhere. They struck the roof with dull thuds, ricocheted off the car hoods, rolled into the grass, with no one able to locate where they came from. One of the officers walked over to Theodore. We've never seen anything like this. It's not a prank, and it's not kids. There's nobody out there. Ted stood mute for a moment, dumbfounded by the absurdity of the scene. The officer added, almost joking, "If I were you, I'd call a priest." A priest. The idea seemed absurd. What could a man of the church do against stones falling from the sky? But deep down, Theodore already understood that something beyond natural law was at work in their home. The rain of stones stopped after an hour. The officers left with no explanation to offer. No suspect, no trace, nothing. And as soon as the sun began to sink, it started again. This time it wasn't only knocking or noises. It was the very matter of the house that seemed to lose its bearings. In the living room, a lamp lifted slowly before being hurled against the wall. A coffee table tipped onto its side. The couch cushions were torn away one by one, as if shaken by an invisible hand. The kitchen rang with metallic sounds. Cutlery, pots, objects moved with no apparent logic. Night fell, and with it, the walls vibrated. In the master bedroom, Ted and Helen watched the furniture move again. A wardrobe pivoted slowly. A lamp fell for no reason. Drawers slammed on their own. Upstairs, Brian screamed in his room. The books had flown off a shelf, hurled one after another as if struck by an invisible gust. Patty stayed silent. The board still wasn't answering, but in the middle of the turmoil, she had begun to feel something else. A presence, no longer gentle, but intrusive, heavy, oppressive, as if the thing she had loved had changed. She no longer dared enter her room at night. By morning, the house looked like a battlefield. Broken objects, displaced furniture, shattered glass. Helen was barely holding on. Ted knew he had to do something. He thought of the officer's words, and reluctantly, he decided to follow them. He was Catholic without practicing. He still held a certain respect for the church. That day he called the local presbytery. The voice on the line was calm. He explained what they were living through, the levitating objects, the knocking, the impossible phenomena, and the stones, above all, the stones. The priest, skeptical at first, asked for the address. He would come and see. When the priest crossed the threshold of the Donovan house that day, everything stopped. The knocking ceased. The air went perfectly still. No more vibration, no more murmuring, as if the presence of a man of the church had suspended the very breath of whatever haunted the place. He walked slowly through the wreckage of the living room, stepped over overturned furniture, looked at the shattered ornaments on the floor, the bent frames. He listened to Theodore with a neutral, almost distant expression. Then, after glancing through the rest of the rooms, he simply declared that there was nothing supernatural here, that in his view, the situation was psychological, perhaps even collective, a family malaise, or an unconscious need to create chaos. He recommended they see a psychiatrist. Then he turned and left. The moment the door closed, the knocking resumed, louder, sharper, and the levitations with it, as if the house itself were rejecting that rational verdict. Theodore stood frozen in the entryway, unable to speak. That day, he arrived late to work, features drawn. He ended up confiding in the only person he still fully trusted, his supervisor. The man listened without interrupting, then slowly told him about a couple he'd heard of on the radio. Their name is Warren, I think. They deal with cases like that. Blessed objects, rituals. I don't know how to reach them, but you should try. That conversation, improbable as it was, gave Theodore a form of hope. That evening, coming home, he went down to the cellar and brought up a plaster statue of Saint Anne, about 18 inches tall. He didn't really know why. He didn't pray. But it was all he had. He placed it carefully upstairs on a dresser near the living room. He had barely set it down when a deafening noise came from the floor below. He ran down. In the rec room, the furniture was literally floating. A table turned slowly on itself. Chairs swayed in the air, legs forward. The soap, the detergent bottles, the cleaning products from the laundry room had lifted off the floor too, spilling their contents into a slick, reeking pool. Theodore had no time to think. It was a waking nightmare. He ran back upstairs to get the statue. It was gone. Later that evening, they found it in the bathroom, set beside the toilet. No one had moved it. No one had even left the room. That night, the sounds intensified again. Inhuman cries passed through the walls. Shrill scraping rose from under the floorboards. And in the morning, the statue had vanished once more. They found it under the covers of the bed in the guest room near Brian's bedroom. His door, until then spotless, was now covered in obscenities scrawled in pencil, religious insults, blasphemous messages, like the kind you'd find in a filthy public restroom. No pencil had been left in that room. No child would have dared. And yet the words were there. Sleep had become impossible. Ted, worn down by exhaustion and dread, finally made a decision. Get his family out. Get away. Break the link. They packed in haste, took spare clothes and toiletries, and left for a nearby motel, a single room, so they could stay together. The first night was worse. The lights turned themselves on and off. Pictures fell from the walls. And above all, the knocking was there. Just like at home. The same sequences of 3. The same sounds traveling from wall to wall. In the morning, coming back from breakfast, they found their room turned upside down. Furniture overturned, drawers emptied, mattresses flipped, sheets torn off, clothes thrown everywhere. Moments later, the manager knocked on their door. He looked embarrassed but firm. Several guests had complained. He'd been told their children had been banging on the walls all night. The housekeeper was talking about vandalism. Ted apologized and promised it wouldn't happen again. The next night, it all started over. They had no choice but to go home. It was Saturday, April 6th, and what they found when they opened the door was beyond imagining. A foul smell poured out of the house. Mildew, chemicals, alcohol, organic waste. The carpets were covered in spilled food. The beds were soaked with cleaning products, perfume, shoe polish. The toilets had been blocked with rolled-up towels. In every room, the furniture was either overturned or broken, and on the walls, words everywhere scrawled in red ink, accusations, insults, obscene religious references. Some sentences seemed written in a furious rush, others more coldly, as if someone had taken the time to think them through. Ted and Helen said nothing, not a word. They spent the day cleaning, gathering, washing, putting things back. But in their movements, there was no anger left and no hope. Only the sensation of being watched, studied, already taken. And somewhere, in the silence of the house, something was waiting. On Sunday, April 7th, the Donovans had visitors. It was Palm Sunday, and Phil, Theodore's brother, had promised to come by for lunch with his wife and children. Helen had hoped this family gathering would bring back some semblance of normality, and perhaps that Ted could finally share what he was going through with someone he trusted. A brother was not a colleague, or a neighbor, or even a skeptical priest. As soon as they arrived, Ted and Helen took Phil aside. They told him everything. The knocking in the walls, the moving objects, the insults on the walls, the stones falling from the sky. Everything. Phil listened without interrupting. Then he ran a hand through his hair, gave a nervous smile, and said there had to be an explanation, something rational, even if it escaped them for now. During the meal, nothing unusual happened. Not a suspicious sound, not a displaced object. Even the light bulbs, so temperamental in recent days, stayed perfectly steady. It was almost frustrating for Theodore, who had so wanted an outsider to see what he was living. After lunch, Phil offered to show some slides from their last family trip. He had brought a projector and a set of images, including one from a religious theme park, where they had visited recreations of biblical sites. The group settled in the rec room. The lights went off. The images scrolled slowly across the wall. And then, a murmur. Someone pointed at a detail in the image, a statue of a cross. At that exact moment, a trickle of water began running down the wall, just beneath the projection. The water seemed to come from nowhere, as if the wall itself were weeping. Before anyone could react, the lamps flickered and went out abruptly, an oppressive silence. Then a dull sound, knocking upstairs, sharp, rapid impacts echoing through the ceiling. Ted and Phil leapt from their seats and ran up. But each time they approached a sound, it seemed to move away, sliding from room to room, always out of reach. A step behind them, Phil's wife and children followed, unable to stay downstairs alone. And then, a deafening din. The entire roof seemed to shake, as if struck with a sledgehammer. The walls trembled. Several frames fell, glass exploding on the floor. Phil went pale. There was no logical explanation left to offer, nothing left to deny. Hurrying downstairs with his family, he grabbed Ted by the shoulder, eyes bright with alarm. There is nothing natural about what's happening here. This isn't a domestic problem. It isn't a matter of belief either. You need to find someone who will actually listen to this. Another priest, a real one. Then he left with his wife and children without turning back. He would not return. That evening, the tension reached a breaking point. In the living room, voices rose for no apparent reason. Absurd accusations, cutting words, threats even. Brian was shouting. Helen stared at him, tears in her eyes. Patty stayed frozen, as if absent. When Ted tried to intervene, she stood up abruptly and left the room, locking herself in without a word. That climate of quiet violence, of emotional derailment, was not like them. Something was deforming their relationships, as if the presence in the house were now trying to make them explode from within. The next morning, Monday, April 8th, Ted came down to the kitchen. He was pale, drawn. He stared at the window in silence over a half-full cup of coffee. Just beyond the garden, on a small hill, stood an austere building, the neighboring retirement home run by a religious order, and on its roof a large wooden cross. He had never really looked at it before. That morning, it appeared to him like an answer, a signal. That afternoon he went there. At reception, a man in a simple robe opened the door, a lined face, a slow gait. Ted hesitated, then started talking. He told him about the stones, the furniture, the smells, the screams. He did his best to stay coherent, but deep down, he knew how deranged his account must sound. The monk listened without mockery, without surprise. Then he gave a small nod. "Come with me." They walked back to the Donovan house together in silence. Inside, the monk inspected the rooms. He looked at the walls covered in graffiti, the displaced furniture, the scattered objects. He crouched by the shards of glass on the floor, laid a hand on a dark mark and listened to the knocking echoing in the walls. Not once did he seem surprised. Then he sat down, invited Ted to do the same, and spoke in a calm voice. "I'm not certain I understand all of it, but some things are not chance. What you're describing resembles what used to be called manifestations of the evil spirit, not a ghost, not a lost soul, something older and crueler. Ted listened, breath short. I'm not in a position to help you directly. There's a protocol in the church, a discernment. It has to be shown that what's happening here goes beyond reason. But I know some people, a couple. They're used to these cases. Their name is Warren, Ed and Lorraine Warren. Ted stared at him. The name wasn't unfamiliar. His supervisor days earlier had already mentioned those paranormal investigators. He hadn't pushed it. He'd assumed a coincidence. But twice, in so few days. The monk made a phone call from the retirement home. He came back a few minutes later with a number written on a crumpled piece of paper. You should call them, and don't wait. Ted did it that same day. A woman's voice answered. Judy, the assistant who handled calls in the couple's absence. She listened carefully, asked a few questions, never interrupted. At the end, she simply said that Ed and Lorraine were away for a few more days, but that she would pass the message on. They would call back Saturday morning. They would have to hold out until then. But the house had no intention of waiting. The silence in the house was not calm. Every member of the family was at the end of their nerves, drained, drawn, eyes lost. Even the simplest gestures seemed suspended in a strange slowness, as if time itself had begun to doubt. And at dawn, unsurprisingly, the stones came back. They fell without reason, without logical trajectory, sometimes as if slowed in the air, sometimes hurled with such violence they buried themselves in the ground. Tiny pebbles, but also heavy blocks, appearing out of nothing to rain down on the roof, the walls, the yard, relentlessly. Every dawn, the same assault. Every evening, the same anxious reprieve. Inside, the house was turning hostile. Religious objects were systematically knocked over or torn down. Crucifixes ended up on the floor, sometimes broken. Holy images were slashed. The statue of St. Anne that Ted had brought up seemed to be the object of a particular hatred. It disappeared again and again, as if an invisible hand refused its presence. Once, they found it hidden in the guest bed, under the covers, as though the entity wanted to defile it. Any sign of the sacred triggered an immediate reaction. Even photographs, rosaries, simple scribbled prayers were turned over, moved, torn apart. A silent war against the holy. One night, Ted and Helen were woken by a violent noise in Brian's room. When they opened the door, the bed had been taken apart. The mattress had been shoved under the frame, and the box spring was propped against the wall, covering a picture of Jesus. The intent was too precise to ignore. This was no longer simple disturbance. This was desecration. The next day in the living room, a long and mournful groan rose from the kitchen, an almost human sound, but twisted. The refrigerator had been dragged to the middle of the room, pulled to the end of its cord. The sound repeated, and each time, they found the fridge in the same spot, far from where it belonged. On Thursday, opening the freezer to which he alone had the key, Ted found something impossible. His anvil, the one he kept in the garage. Heavy, massive, carefully placed, sealed in the ice. Later that day, he found his toolbox, a large metal case, moved without a sound or apparent effort all the way up to the attic. Logic had no place anymore. But what haunted them now wasn't what they saw. It was what they felt. In every room, in every corner, a presence, a visceral sense of being watched, as if someone or something stood just behind them. They heard quiet, insistent footsteps, breathing, the rustle of clothing, sometimes a slow, hoarse breath that seemed to float in the air. None of them really slept. They took turns staying awake, or collapsed from exhaustion in corners of the house where the dread felt thinner. One evening, Helen spun around, sensing a presence behind her. A blurred black silhouette stood in the hallway. When she blinked, it was gone. And then came Friday, April 12th, Good Friday. The atmosphere that day was different, heavy, saturated. Even the walls seemed to vibrate with contained tension. Every hour spent in that house felt like an invisible confrontation, a closed room with something elusive and deeply malevolent. Nobody spoke anymore. Nobody protested. The slightest sound made them jump. Daylight brought no comfort. Ted spent most of his time at the window watching the road. Helen stayed near Brian, nearly mute. Patty was withdrawn, detached, as if floating outside the real. That evening, they had only one hope left. A voice on the phone had promised to pass their message on. 5 days earlier, 2 names had been mentioned, Ed and Lorraine Warren. And they waited, in a house that fractured a little more with every hour. At just after 6 in the evening on April 12th, a flight from the west landed at LaGuardia Airport. Among the passengers, a discreet couple, visibly exhausted by a long investigative tour, Ed and Lorraine Warren. They did not yet know that in less than 24 hours, a new case would call them into one of the most disturbing situations they had ever encountered. The next day, around midday, the phone rang at their Connecticut home. Lorraine picked up. On the other end, a man's voice, hoarse, breathless, full of distress. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need help. My family is in danger." His name was Theodore Donovan. For about 15 minutes, he tried to explain the inexplicable. He spoke of stones falling from the sky, of furniture thrown against walls, of obscene writing, displaced objects, strange sounds. His voice trembled, as if each word cost more than the last. Lorraine listened in silence. She had heard hundreds of similar calls, some exaggerated, some sincere, but misread. But this time, something rang true. Too true. There was no sensationalism in his account, no search for attention, only fear, raw and direct. She answered gently. "My husband is committed elsewhere today, but if you agree, we could come tomorrow." Ted accepted without hesitation. One more day would change nothing, he thought. He had been living in dread for 6 weeks. The Warrens loaded their car and drove out. They arrived in the early afternoon at a house that looked peaceful from the outside. Clear sky, well-kept lawn, except for the dozens of stones scattered here and there, as if dropped at random. That detail did not go unnoticed, but it was only stepping inside that the scale of the situation became clear. The furniture was damaged, some of it broken. The walls were covered in graffiti, most of it obscene. An unpleasant smell hung in the air, a mixture of detergent, alcohol, and mildew. Lorraine stopped dead, just past the threshold. Her gaze drifted into nothing. "There are presences here," she murmured. She didn't need to go further to feel it. They were many. They were furious. And above all, they were waiting. Ed stayed focused. He knew Lorraine's first impression was often decisive, but the facts had to be established room by room. Ted welcomed them, shook their hands, introduced his wife Helen and their children. Then he guided them through every corner of the house, showing the marks, the damage, the displaced objects, describing the events as they went. In Brian's room, a box spring had been thrown against a wall. In the laundry room, detergent had been emptied for no reason. In the living room, the statue of St. Anne had disappeared and reappeared again and again, as if it disturbed an invisible presence. Lorraine stayed silent. She watched, she felt. When the tour was over, Ed gathered the whole family around the table. He explained that he now had to ask a series of questions to identify the origin of the phenomenon. Everyone agreed without argument. They were at the end of their rope. "When did you notice the very first strange incident?" "March 3rd, Ted answered after a moment. "Right after my daughter Patty came back from the pharmacy with a flat tire." "Has anyone close to you died recently? Perhaps under unusual circumstances?" "No." "Have you brought an old object into the house recently? A figurine, a piece of furniture, something ethnic or religious?" "No, nothing like that." "Has any of you consulted a psychiatrist or taken part in any occult activity? Seances, hypnosis, automatic writing, deep meditation?" "No," Ted answered, slightly thrown. Ed then turned to the children. He avoided asking teenagers directly when he could. But in some cases, there was no choice. "Has any of you ever used a spirit device? A board, for example?" A silence settled. Then a timid voice, almost stifled. "Me." Every head turned toward Patty. "Can you tell us about it?" Lorraine asked gently. The girl breathed in deeply. "A few months ago I bought a board, just out of curiosity. I thought it was only a game. I started using it in my room. and one day I got an answer. It was someone, a boy apparently, who had died in the area. He said he needed to talk. He was kind. He complimented me. He told me I was pretty, that I could trust him. He even predicted some things that came true. Lorraine exchanged a look with Ed. She knew this pattern all too well. Did he tell you his name? No. He said he wasn't allowed. I asked him often, but he always refused. And are you still communicating today? No. I haven't heard from him since I asked him to show himself. It was one night. I wanted to see him, and after that, nothing. Which night exactly? Patty thought for a moment, then got up to fetch a notebook from her room. She came back. March 2nd. Ted straightened, and the first incident happened the next day. Nobody spoke. The coincidence was too clean to ignore. For a long moment, the Warrens stayed silent, letting the information settle. Then Ed spoke. He told them about entities, about infestations, about the early signs. He explained without softening it what spiritual oppression was. He didn't embellish, didn't dramatize. He wanted them to truly understand. When he was done, Ted murmured, "And how can you be so sure?" "Because it's our work," Ed answered, "and because you are not alone. We have seen this too many times." At the end of the day, Ed and Lorraine stepped outside alone for a few moments. The case was serious, more serious than they had imagined. The entity had not only infested the house, it had infested the family itself. It was following them, and above all, it now seemed to be feeding on them. For the Warrens, there was only one option: bring in the church. But they had to move fast. Every day spent waiting was another day the Donovans risked sinking further. And now, the presence of an investigator was no longer enough. Ed knew the next step could not be taken without the church's backing. He told Lorraine the following morning, and before the sun had fully cleared the damp hills, he picked up the phone to call a man he trusted, Father Jason. A young, discreet, methodical priest, Jason was not an exorcist, not yet. But he had followed Ed on other cases as an observer, and above all, he believed. He knew that some houses did more than creak at night. On Saturday afternoon, Father Jason arrived at the Donovan house. Ed and Lorraine were about to leave briefly for another investigation, scheduled weeks earlier, which they could not cancel. But they stayed on alert, ready to come back at the first call. Before leaving the house, Ed took Jason aside. "What you're going to experience here is beyond anything they teach in seminary," he said gravely. "I'm ready," the priest answered, his face tight. "No, you're not. Nobody really is." In a heavy silence, Ed handed him a folded piece of paper, their personal number, and that of Father Sullivan, his superior at the diocese. Then he put a hand on the young man's shoulder. "If it gets to be too much, call." The Warrens left at dusk. That night, Father Jason discovered what the family had been living for over a month. Sudden cracks inside the walls, objects vanishing and reappearing in locked rooms, a rancid smell like spoiled meat that seemed to move through the house, and above all, a presence. The priest was not alone. Of that, he was certain. The thing knew he was there, and it was enjoying itself. By the next day, the manifestation seemed calculated. Every time he thought of something, a pencil, a glass of water, a prayer book, the object would appear, sometimes set down near him, sometimes in slow levitation, suspended in the air as if offered by an invisible hand. It might have seemed absurd. To Jason, it was a statement. "I know what you want. I know what you're thinking." On Monday, April 22nd, Father Jason moved into the house officially. He wanted to observe, to understand, to record. He spent long hours with each member of the family. This was not yet an exorcism. It was an evaluation, the kind that precedes the irreversible. Ted, weakened, seemed to have lost part of himself. He spoke only in fragments, as if saving his strength to endure each minute in that house. He no longer slept. He barely ate, and he refused to leave. His medication, missing every morning, systematically turned up in the toilet, thrown away like a warning or a threat. Helen tried to keep her head up. She prayed often, sometimes aloud, sometimes in silence. But beneath the surface, she was caught between grief, incomprehension, and anger. More than once, she had asked the priest where God was in all this. Why them? Why now? Brian stayed shut in his room for hours, staring at a wall. Sometimes he mumbled. Sometimes he drew strange shapes, twisted faces. He had stopped going to school, and he no longer answered his parents when they called him. Patty was growing more unstable. One day, she laughed nervously. The next, she slammed doors, insulted her mother, curled up in a corner without a word. Several times she had turned on Father Jason with an aggression she didn't seem to control, and in her absent moments, she spoke, but in a voice too deep, too calm, almost foreign. On Tuesday, April 23rd, while he was on the phone with Ed Warren for an update, Jason watched a rosary float slowly down the hallway. It came from the guest room. It glided at eye height, turned left, then right, and wrapped itself silently around a chair in the kitchen. That wasn't a random act, that was a signature. Ed, on the other end of the line, was categorical. Get everyone out. Leave the house. Right now. The priest didn't argue. Within the hour, they had packed. Ted, Helen, and the children got in the car and took refuge with Ted's parents. But from the very first night, the phenomena resumed. Photographs torn down, lights flickering, objects levitating. The thing had followed them. Meanwhile, Jason was living under the same grip. A black silhouette waited for him at the end of the hallway, a shape with no face. Every night, the same presence kept him awake, and he too began to lose his footing. On Thursday, April 25th, the Warrens came back. They met Jason downtown and went to the house together. Ed went in alone. The smell of rot was unbearable. The floor shook. The walls vibrated. When he came out, his shirt was stained with blood. On his arm, 2 deep gashes, crossed. At midday, the Donovans returned. The shock was immense. They tidied what they could. By evening, everything seemed almost normal, in appearance, but the air was still vibrating. On Friday, April 26th, Jason wrote the exorcism file with Lorraine's help. He assembled the evidence. What normally took weeks was done in a single night. On Saturday, April 27th, Ed made a joke about Ted's car. I hope the entity appreciates German engines. The next day, it had been sabotaged. On Sunday morning, April 28th, the phone rang. It was Father Jason. His usually steady voice was tight with contained tension. Father Sullivan had given his approval. The exorcism would take place. A confirmed priest would be sent. But the ritual could only be performed after 3 full days of prayer and fasting. The date was set. Thursday, May 2nd. 3 more days to hold out. 3 days of siege. 3 days of trial. In the house, the news set off a mix of hope and terror. Hope of imminent release, but also fear of what would come first, because the entity already seemed to know. That very evening, the manifestations changed in nature. Everything accelerated, as if the evil, sensing its end approaching, had entered a feverish rage. On Sunday night, in a moment of apparent calm, a metallic sound rang through the house. Heavy radiator plates, suddenly torn from their fixings, disappeared without explanation. Seconds later, a dull crash shook the floor. They had come hurtling down the cellar stairs, hurled as if by an invisible force. Later that night, a ladder nearly 16 feet long appeared in Patty's bedroom. No one had moved it. No one knew how it could have gotten there. The next day, Lorraine, staying with Ed in Brian's room, heard the sharp sound of falling metal. Turning around, she saw a hinge slide out of its socket on its own, then a second. Then the door vanished, literally, as if swallowed by the air. Minutes later, the closet door met the same fate. They were found in the basement, one laid on top of the other. The oppression was becoming senseless. On May 1st, the eve of the exorcism, there was no more question of sleep. The danger was everywhere. Watches were assigned. In turns, the adults patrolled the house, alert for the slightest sign of attack. The lamps stayed lit. Voices stayed low. Everyone knew the night could tip at any moment. That evening, around 10:30, Lorraine stopped in the hall. In front of her, the living room doorway began to glow. A powerful, almost blinding light emanated from it, too intense to look at directly. Ed and Jason, already in the room, saw the same thing. A silhouette was slowly forming in that unreal chaos. Lorraine came in through another door, joined the men, and watched the apparition take shape. A blurred body, a vague presence, but one that fixed on Ed. "Tell us who you are," Ed said. The thing did not answer. It stayed there, frozen in the light, almost human, but not quite. Lorraine frowned. "That is not a human spirit, Ed. It's only a mask. Step back." She had barely spoken when 2 armchairs were hurled violently at Ed. One pinned him to the wall. The apparition withdrew slowly, as if satisfied with its effect. Then it vanished. Seconds later, a small bottle of nail polish rose from the floor and shot across the room at full speed, grazing Ed's skull before shattering against a wall. It was midnight. 12 hours left to hold. Strangely, after that attack, the house seemed to settle. Not a sound, not a creak. A lull as sudden as it was unsettling. Around 5 in the morning, the sky began to pale. The birds sang, and for the first time in weeks, something like peace settled over the house. At 8, they all went to Mass. Then, in a heavy silence, they came back and waited. Father Mark arrived at 9:30 exactly. He was a man in his 50s, head shaved, expression grave. He wore a black shirt with a white collar and moved with a heavy step, as if already carrying the weight of the task ahead. He had prayed, fasted, meditated. He was ready. He first withdrew with Ed into the kitchen. "In your opinion," he asked, "is it only a demon acting here?" "No," Ed answered. "There's something else. A lower entity, an incubus perhaps. But the heart of the evil is a demon, and a powerful one." The priest nodded slowly. Then they joined the others in the living room. From his bag he drew a violet stole, kissed it, and placed it around his neck. He blessed each person present one by one to protect them during the ritual. Then he began to read. The words rang out slowly with authority, a mixture of English and Latin, broken by silences, psalms, injunctions, orders addressed to the invisible. After an hour he raised his voice. "I command you, unclean spirit, by the judge of the living and the dead, by the creator of the world, give your name, give a sign, and leave this place." Silence. He began again, louder. "Every unclean spirit, every demon, every power of hell, come out in the name of the Lord." That was when Helen, white-faced, pointed at the fireplace. Every gaze converged, and what they saw defied understanding. A standing silhouette, horned, cloven-footed, a tail, a smell of decomposing flesh, a presence from somewhere else. Father Mark threw holy water. "Leave this house in the name of God." The apparition dissolved in an instant, but on the carpet a new face surged up, red, wide, horned, eyes full of hatred, a mouth twisted in a bestial grin. Ed, frozen, watched the priest step forward and sprinkle the floor. The face stared back. It seemed alive. Then slowly, very slowly, it faded, leaving behind nothing but a pinkish stain. The priest spoke again. "The sign has been given. Lord, we entrust this house to you. Protect it. Restore its peace." He blessed the Donovans one last time, and in a crushing silence, closed his book. The ritual was over, but nothing in the faces of those present betrayed relief, because they all knew that some wounds, once closed, go on bleeding for a long time. What played out inside the walls of the Donovan house from March 3rd to May 2nd was described by Ed and Lorraine Warren as one of the most intense demonic attacks they ever encountered. 60 days of a silent, methodical, relentless struggle, and a deliverance that came in a matter of moments. Brutal, final. After the exorcism, calm returned. No furniture moved again. Objects stayed where they were put. The nights, at last, went quiet, but no one came out of it unharmed. Ed Warren documented every event, every date, every testimony. Among them, the account of Ted's brother, Phil Donovan, who had been dragged into that spiral of horror against his will. He wrote, "Neither I nor anyone in my family had ever experienced anything so strange and frightening. I am certain my children, like my wife, will remember that dark experience forever. The incomprehensible situation we witnessed left our family in total confusion. It defies every rational explanation. All the evidence and facts of this supernatural mystery should be examined rigorously by competent people. And if such an analysis is ever carried out, I am convinced it will reveal an unsettling truth, that of a force at work, very real, but not human. The house stayed standing, a little damaged, less welcoming, but still there. Ted and Helen went on living in it. They couldn't afford to move, and deep down, they hoped the worst was behind them. Brian went back to school, Patty married, she became a mother 3 times over, and the months passed. The material damage left its own mark. Over $5,000 in repairs, broken furniture, torn carpets, gutted mattresses, bent pipes, a punctured roof, doors ripped off, and no compensation. Their insurance refused to cover what is still classified as an act of God. But it isn't visible damage that marks you longest, because in every corner of that house, beneath the replaced carpets, behind the repainted walls, something still lingered, a sensation, a memory, a weight. And though peace had returned, it no longer wore quite the same face, because once you have seen the invisible, it becomes impossible to forget.